And growing up, I was terrified of my Uncle Hugh. Just the sight of his black-suited silhouette on the porch was enough to send me packing to my room. I would close the door and listen to the muffled shouting match in the living room, which always ended the same way, with Uncle Hugh's angry footsteps retreating to his sleek black Lincoln Continental. It was the fanciest vehicle that had ever parked in our driveway, but to my childish eyes, it looked like a hearse. "Your uncle's a dangerous man," my father would always remind me. "You gotta be careful what you say around him, and you definitely shouldn't let him take you any place. You understand?" I nodded and pretended that I knew what he meant. In my heart, I was just glad that the tall, sinister stranger was finally gone. At least until this next visit. On the night of May 14th, one of the worst rainstorms the county had ever seen hammered down on the roof. I was sitting in the living room playing with a toy bulldozer when a familiar set of headlights appeared in the window. My blood ran cold. Uncle Hugh had never shown up before while my parents weren't home, but there was a first time for everything. The heavy footfalls on the front porch only served to confirm what I already knew. My uncle wasn't alone. I didn't recognize the uniformed men behind him, but the grim expressions on their faces didn't bode well. I ran to bolt the door just as my parents had taught me, but I wasn't quick enough. Hugh and the two strangers burst into the house. He wrapped his long arms around me before I could slip away, and then he hugged me to his chest and began to sob. Later, a kind, red-headed woman explained to me that my parents, Bill and Tanya McComber, would never be coming home. And they had been killed in a confrontation with police while breaking into a local pharmacy in search of pills to sell. The woman told me that her name was Becky and she was something called a social worker. In a few minutes, she added, a doctor would come in to run some tests. Afterwards, I pressed my ear to the door and listened while Becky talked to Uncle Hugh about something called malnutrition. She wanted my uncle to take me in, but Hugh refused. He couldn't have a child, he insisted, especially not in a house like his. And Becky reminded Hugh that this was his only chance to act. If he didn't, I would become a ward of the state. A few hours later, I was on my way to start my new life with Uncle Hugh. I lay my cheek against the Lincoln's tan leather back seat and watched raindrops roll across the night beyond the windows. I didn't know where I was going or what the future held, but I was too numb or exhausted to care. At some point, I fell asleep. I awoke to bright sunlight shining into my eyes. The texture of the sheets was unfamiliar, but it wasn't unpleasant. I rolled out of bed and shivered at the cold hardwood floor beneath my feet. My stomach rumbled as I wandered down the hallway. The place looked like a museum. Antique furniture, paintings on the walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The air smelled like wood wax and old paper. Everything was so spotlessly clean that it felt like I was still dreaming. And yet, as I descended the stairs, I could already see Uncle Hugh, bent over some pans and a weird steaming cylinder in the kitchen. His pajamas were so somber and formal looking that for a second, I thought that he was cooking breakfast in a suit. After an uncomfortable silence, Uncle Hugh cleared his throat and asked if I had slept well. I told him that I had. He apologized for not having any kid stuff for me to eat, but promised to take me shopping later. It was that statement which finally drove home the reality of it all. From now on, I really was going to be living with Hugh. My uncle placed some plates on the table, poured coffee from the weird cylinder thing, and then sat down in his chair and waited for me to join him. Almost reluctantly, I followed his example. There were too many forks, and I had to lean awkwardly around a big vase of lilies anytime that I wanted to talk. But breakfast was delicious. fried potatoes with spring onions, crisp, peppery bacon, French toast alongside whipped cream and blackberry jam. Part of me wanted to ask jokingly if Uncle Hugh was fattening me up to eat for his dinner later. Another part was afraid to give the strange man sitting across the table any ideas. I had climbed down from my chair, wiped my sleeve across my face, and was getting ready to run off when 3 sharp knocks caused me to turn back toward Hugh. There was no sign that Hugh had made the sound, but the look on his face was painful to see. He had pushed in his chair and gathered his plates to wash. Even his cloth napkin was neatly refolded. I hadn't even used mine. Looking anywhere but into my uncle's eyes, I shuffled back to the sink and I helped him clean up. It was only later, after Hugh smiled and told me to go explore my new home, that I came to wonder exactly what it was that I had heard that morning. I could have spent all day just marveling at the knickknacks in Uncle Hugh's woodshop, or flipping through the leather-bound art books in the study, some which seemed taller than I was. There were 8 bedrooms, a wine cellar, even a cupola. On our way to the grocery store a few hours later, I asked Uncle Hugh if our family was descended from royalty. For the first time since I had known him, my stern, hard-nosed uncle laughed. According to him, the house only dated to the 1850s. He had bought it 10 years earlier in an estate auction. At the time, it didn't occur to me to wonder why a middle-aged single man would have wanted all those empty and echoing rooms. I was just happy to sit in a wing-backed armchair by the cupola's window, watching pedestrians amble along the shady streets below, and trying once again to convince myself that this all wasn't a dream. That first week was a learning experience for both of us. I learned that food could be more than just what I scavenged from the bottom of an old cereal box or a half-spoiled takeout container, while my uncle learned more than he had probably ever wanted to about pro wrestlers, monster trucks, and how to get chocolate milk stains out of a Turkish carpet. I was shocked to discover that Hugh didn't have a television, and even more shocked to learn that he cleaned the whole house himself every week. I had expected that he would have a maid or something. Time to get to work, Uncle Hugh told me that first Sunday, handing me a child-sized broom and a ridiculous old-fashioned feather duster. This is your house now too, you know. Although Hugh didn't appear to have a romantic partner, game nights and dinner parties were a frequent occurrence at our house. The most regular visitors were Darius Liddell, Helen Ashmont, and Arthur Blevins, old friends of Hugh's who had gone on to become important figures in the community. I didn't understand a lot of what they talked about, but I enjoyed just listening to them. Hugh's friends, on the other hand, always seemed wary around me, as though I were a half-wild dog who couldn't be trusted not to bite. And during Christmas shopping that year, Hugh and I got into our first major argument, the sort that starts over nothing and then spirals out of control. If Hugh supposedly cared so much about me, I found myself screaming, then why hadn't he come for me sooner? Why had he left me to rot with people who he knew were awful? Although the mall parking lot where we stood must have been full of honking cars, children's shouts, and tinny holiday music, the only sound that I remember was the crunch of my new boots in the snow as I threw a punch at my uncle. Hugh caught it, and then he got down to eye level with me and put a hand on my shoulder. "No, it's not that simple," Hugh sighed. "But you know what? Every time I saw you run away down that hallway, it was like losing my little brother all over again." It was the closest that Hugh ever came to talking about Dad. There were other subjects that my uncle avoided, like the uncanny noises that I had begun to notice around the house. When I first asked about the scratching between the walls, he blamed rats or the house settling. Even at 8 years old, I knew there was more to all those thumps and creaks. And then later that winter, I overheard a conversation inside the wall. It's hard to overstate just how dark Uncle Hugh's house became after sunset. Electricity was a late addition to the place, and the only illumination that my uncle kept on was a tiny nightlight in the hallway bathroom. And getting to it felt like wading through a river of black ink. One night, I heard 2 sets of footsteps approaching while I was on my way back to bed. One was uneven and rushed, like a person trying to run on an injured leg. The second took their time with a slow, heavy, and almost eloquent steps. At first, I thought that maybe they were Hugh's guests, but that was impossible. They never left the dining room or stayed so late, and besides, why hadn't they turned on the lights? The first stranger let out a pained gasp, as though they couldn't quite get enough air into their lungs to scream. A second later, they apologized to someone. They hadn't seen anybody for a long time, they said, and they wanted to know if whoever they had run into had found a way out. They wanted to know where the exit was. The second stranger didn't respond right away. There was a clattering as they turned, like the talons of some great bird of prey scraping against an iron perch. "There is no exit," they told the first man. And then came the crash of a heavy mass being slammed against a hard surface. The rasping breath stopped. I stayed frozen halfway down the hallway listening, but I heard no more strange conversations that night. When I asked Uncle Hugh if anybody had been in the house the night before, he shook his head. And then he looked at me with those piercing gray-green eyes and asked if I wanted to talk to someone. I could see where the conversation was headed. Since I didn't want to worry my uncle or have my brain picked by any more child psychologists, I told Hugh that I had probably just dreamed up the whole thing. He seemed to let it go at that. But when I went upstairs to get ready for bed that evening, there were 2 new nightlights in the hallway. And by the time that I finished middle school, the noises of Uncle Hugh's house had become just a fact of life. Like the bottom stair that I kept stubbing my toe on, or the shower curtain ring that always seemed to stick when I tried to close it. I might have gone on believing that forever, if it wasn't for the blackouts that rolled through town during the sweltering summer before my freshman year. Although the house wasn't air-conditioned, its thick walls usually kept the temperature fairly even inside, but there was nothing that they could do against such high temperatures. Even laying on a damp towel with the windows wide open, I just couldn't cool off enough to sleep. I took to prowling the halls restlessly, searching for a relief from the heat. And as I did, I noticed something strange. Doors kept opening and closing, as though Uncle Hugh were awake too, wandering around in search of something. The last door that I had heard was Hugh's office. I approached it and whispered my uncle's name. There was no answer when I knocked. Suddenly worried, I nudged the door open with the tip of my toe and I peered through the crack. I didn't recognize the room on the other side. There were no windows on any of the walls. Blanket-covered furniture was scattered throughout the space, and 2 corridors led deeper into the darkness. The street was just on the other side of the wall, which meant that those hallways couldn't be real. All of this was wrong. A part of me knew that I should turn back, but another part yearned to dive deeper into a mystery that all of my uncle's hand-waving explanations had done nothing to resolve. I took a breath and I stepped into the unfamiliar room. For the first time in weeks, I felt cold. The clammy, stale air reminded me of an underground parking garage or maybe a cave. There was no noise, no wind. Even the nervous scratching of my fingernails against the flashlight's plastic grip seemed painfully loud. I swept its beam across the sheet-covered objects. I was suddenly a lot less sure that they were furniture. And had one of them moved since the last time that I had looked? I shone my flashlight down the corridor to the right, but its light was strong enough to reach its end. I turned toward the corridor on the left. There, my flashlight's beam reflected off a pair of milky white eyes. I bolted out of the still open door, suddenly sure that I wouldn't find myself back in the house that I knew. I had taken a careless step out of the world that I had always known, and now there was no way back. A ghostly light bobbed in the distance. It was Hugh holding an old-fashioned oil lamp. I could feel a hot breeze on my skin, I realized, and outside the cicadas were beginning to whir. My uncle told me that he had been taking a cold shower, but his longish, graying hair wasn't wet, and he had an ugly purple bruise on his right knuckle. He told me to go back to bed, and it wasn't a friendly request. A few years later, when I told my first girlfriend about the strangeness that I had noticed in my uncle's house, she had laughed it off. I had probably just wandered into the wrong room by mistake, she had reasoned, and everybody knew that sound traveled differently in big, echoey old houses like Uncle Hugh's. Her teasing was enough to put it all out of my mind until graduation, when I faced a monumentous choice. I had secretly applied to a few colleges on the West Coast, but that would mean putting over 2,000 miles between myself and Hugh. He had sacrificed so much to raise me. Could I really just up and leave him like that? My uncle must have guessed what was running through my mind, because one afternoon he came up to my reading nook. He had something in his hand. "You know," he said, "I didn't give up my cushy bachelor lifestyle just so that you could loaf around this house for the rest of your life. Here." My uncle handed me 2 envelopes. One was an acceptance letter to my dream school, along with a partial scholarship. The other was the details of a bank account that Hugh had set up in my name several years before. It was more than enough to cover the remaining costs. He went back downstairs without another word. In the years to come, I never forgot what my uncle had done for me. I visited whenever I could, but as Hugh had said, I had my own life to live. And then, one October morning after I came back from a run, I found a series of missed calls on my phone. One was from Hugh, and the rest were from a hospital. My fiancée Sabrina and I flew back to my hometown right away, but it was too late for Hugh. He had been found slumped over at his desk in his law office, felled by an apparent heart attack. He had been pronounced dead at 10:38 a.m., less than an hour after he had called me. A sense of unease wormed its way into my grief. My uncle was a man of few words. I could count on one hand the number of times that we had spoken by phone. So what had he wanted so badly to talk to me about? I was Hugh's only living relative, and he had left me everything, including the house, which was where Sabrina and I stayed while I sorted out the bureaucracy. There was more planning involved than I had ever imagined, and there was something else too. When I opened the first box of Uncle Hugh's possessions, they appeared to have been tampered with. There is a mark in the fine layer of dust where something rectangular had once lay. An envelope, maybe. Regardless of what it was or who had taken it, I had no time to worry about it now. Hugh had been a well-loved member in the community. Darius, Helen, and Arthur were just a few of the black-clad well-wishers who came by to offer their condolences. The days passed by in a gray, bitter whirlwind, and before I knew it, my bereavement leave was up, and it was time to get back to work in Sacramento. And that was when Sabrina approached me with a proposition. The house that I had just inherited, she explained, would make an excellent B&B. The historic college town where it was located saw plenty of traffic, and wouldn't Hugh have wanted me to take care of the place and keep it in the family? If her idea worked, she went on, we would never have to return to our stressful day jobs again. I thought about my childhood memories and I hesitated. Sabrina and I had been sleeping in my childhood bedroom for over a week now. and the only thing that felt strange was Hugh's absence. I was a 28-year-old entrepreneur with a computer science degree. Did I really still believe in haunted houses? Hugh had always kept his home tidy, but Sabrina's touch had turned it into a place that wouldn't have looked out of place on a postcard. From the lavender planters that she had arranged in the windows to the bathroom renovations, my fiancé's enthusiasm and talent astounded me. We decided to rent out the 8 upstairs rooms while living on the main floor. Hugh's parlor became a dining room where we could serve breakfast to our guests. Everything was going smoothly. I couldn't figure out why I felt so tense. Not until I realized that I expected something to go wrong. In my heart, I was waiting for a guest to wander downstairs in their pajamas, asking angrily about voices in the walls in a strange room full of covered furniture. Even during those first chaotic weeks, our bed and breakfast received excellent reviews. It led me to suspect or maybe fear that I was the problem. Hugh had always denied that there was anything unnatural about the house, and Sabrina had never mentioned anything unsettling before either. Maybe it was just my exaggerated childhood fears that had made those muffled thumps and strange scratchings take on a life of their own. Monday, September 5th. I'll never forget that morning. It was cloudy and cool, like a preview of autumn. Sabrina had gone into town to do some shopping. I sang a pop song under my breath as I cleaned up after our weekend guests. I was passing the door that used to be Uncle Hugh's when a ragged voice spoke to me. "Jake, is that you?" It said through the door. "Oh, it's gotta be. I'd know you anywhere, son." I froze, breathing hard. I should have been alone in the house, and I had buried my father almost 20 years ago. But whoever had spoken sounded exactly like him. I was just imagining things, I told myself. But my father's voice kept talking. "Listen, Jake, here's what you gotta do. Don't freak out or run away. Just come over here and open this door." It was the same hoarse, wheedling tone that Dad had always used whenever he wanted something. Unlike the other rooms, there was no daylight shining through the keyhole in front of me. The space on the other side must have been as lightless as the bottom of a well. "This is real important, Jake, you understand? You gotta do the right thing here. If not, there will be a cost." There will be a cost. I recognized that pet phrase as well. It was the one that he always used right before he lifted his hand to strike someone. I took a step backward. Something slammed against the door hard enough to make it shake on its hinges. "Wait." My father's voice screamed. "Stop, Jake. Get back here. Open this door." I didn't stop running until I was downstairs in the kitchen, surrounded by pristine countertops and industry-grade appliances. What I had heard upstairs felt like some sick hallucination. I buried my face in my hands. Was this what going crazy felt like? For the first time since Uncle Hugh had dragged me to a child psychologist, I considered getting professional help. The front door burst open. It was Sabrina, her smile barely visible behind bags packed high with meat, bread, and leafy vegetables. I couldn't bring myself to tell her how my morning had gone. After lunch, she went to take a nap, and I went back upstairs to finish what I had started. Each time I changed a sheet or scrubbed out a sink, I expected to look up and find that the wall behind me had opened like some great black mouth. I expected to see my father's hands, giant-sized, just as I had remembered them from childhood, reaching out from all that hungry darkness. The tension of performing those simple tasks had left my skin covered by the thick, slow sweat of fear, and I rushed to take a shower before Sabrina woke up. I closed my eyes and stepped beneath the hot water, hoping that it would wash away the memory of what I had heard behind that door. Despite the soothing steam, I couldn't make myself relax. It was like there was another sound in the background, just at the edge of my perception. It wasn't until I turned the water off that I realized it was the sound of digging, and it was coming from the other side of the shower tile. The noise reminded me of a gravedigger's shovel scraping against heavy stones. To my horror, my father's voice rose above the cacophony. "Oh, he's here, I swear. Just on the other side of this wall. This isn't a problem that you can dig your way out of, Bill." My mother's tone was cruel and cold. My father fell silent. "We've got to convince him to let us through before he figures out what we become. You understand that, don't you?" In the silence, I could almost imagine one of my father's weak little nods, the ones that he only gave when he knew that he had been beaten. "I want you to check every door in that hallway again, Bill. I don't care what kind of attention you draw. Or do you want to be stuck like this forever?" My mother's voice faded as the toxic couple wandered off. It was them, there was no denying it. But were they between the walls or just inside of my head? Back in the bedroom, Sabrina was hunched over a laptop screen, crunching the numbers for the first quarter. She said that if things kept up like this, we'd be making more than we did out west, with half the work and stress. She took my hand as I sat down on the mattress, my haunted expression hidden behind a mop of wet hair. "It's like a dream," she said. I didn't have the heart to correct her. I couldn't sleep that night. In the dark, every clunk, creak, and scuffle took on a terrible meaning of its own. Was it the hate-filled ghosts of my parents clawing their way up through the floorboards? Or something even worse? Something that I couldn't even imagine? There was a pattern to the sounds, I was sure of it, but my head was spinning too much to piece it together. Sabrina and I kept a pair of flashlights in the nightstand in case of a power outage. I grabbed one and slipped silently out of our bedroom. There were no guests upstairs tonight, and I meant to check every inch of the place. If I didn't find anything, I swore to myself I would make an appointment with a psychiatrist in the morning. The cool hardwood beneath my bare feet reminded me disorientingly of my first morning at Uncle Hugh's. I tried to count the stairs to calm myself, but realized that either I had miscounted or that I had no idea how many there were in the first place. 12, maybe 13. When I had reached the top, I clenched my hand into a fist and I swept my flashlight beam across the long hallway. Of course, there was no one there. As I investigated the first room, I found myself running my fingers along the walls. Was I looking for a secret passage, a gap that rats or something else could use to squeeze through? I wasn't sure. The beds were as neatly made as I had left them earlier. The dressers, desks, and bedside tables were all immaculate. So why did I feel like somebody had been here, was still here, stalking me from some place that I couldn't see? Seized by a sudden impulse, I rapped my knuckles against the wall. Nothing skittered on the other side, but I liked the feel of it. The sense that I was acting instead of just waiting for something to happen to me. Even though I got no response, I kept at it, pausing every few feet to knock again. And then in the fifth room, something knocked back. A female voice whispered a hello through the wall. She sounded sick, as though her throat was clotted by dust or blood. Is someone really there?" the stranger asked, and then she burst into tears. I thought I was alone in here," she sobbed. I thought I was the only one. You've got to help me get out of here." The woman said her name was Emily Gates, and the last thing she remembered is she had been driving home from a club downtown. She had no idea how she had wound up in this cold, lightless labyrinth, or how long she had been there. When I told her that I would be right back, she begged me not to go. She was afraid, I realized, of getting lost again. I backed out of the room, planning to call the police or maybe go look for a sledgehammer. Something brushed against my heel. A white sheet, Nearly 2 decades later, I still recognize that odd gray room. I should have been back in the hallway, but instead, 5 narrow gray corridors led away into the darkness. Somewhere along one of them, I could still hear Emily Gates crying. For the second time in my life, I had crossed over to the other side. I stayed still and listened, but I couldn't discern exactly where Emily's cries were coming from. I called her name and felt the atmosphere in the room suddenly change. Something had stood up beneath one of those white sheets. It moved its head from side to side as though sniffing the air for me. I crept silently down the nearest corridor, too frightened to look back. There were more rooms, but I noticed uncomfortably that none of them had doors. Most were empty, a few were cluttered with junk, and some featured only 1 or 2 items of furniture, often placed in an odd central position as though they were being worshipped. I passed a bathroom on my right, dripping and overrun with black mold, but I didn't wait around to see what was lurking in its nearly overflowing tub. The hallway seemed to be getting smaller. After a few minutes, it was so cramped that I had to duck and angle my shoulders just to keep moving forward. Emily's pleas for help at least seemed to be getting closer. I rounded a corner and there she was. Frizzy blonde hair, a glittery pink shirt, and tight black jeans. Her face was pressed against the wall where she probably imagined me to be. Her cracked, cherry red nails clawed against it desperately. "I'm here," I said, and Emily turned. Pretty blue eyes with long lashes stared out of the charred ruin of her face. Her dislocated jaw hung low over her caved-in chest. "Get me out of this place. I don't want to be here. I want to go back. I want to go back." She moved freakishly fast on those twisted and bent backwards legs. Before I could even begin to run, she had me pinned against the bare gray wall. "This can't be it," the thing that used to be Emily Gates wailed. "This can't be all there is. Show me the way back. Show me now." Her fingers tightened around my throat. I bashed my flashlight against her skull and she didn't seem to notice. Okay, I coughed. "Follow me." I wasn't going to fight my way out of this, but maybe I could lie my way out of it. I tried not to look at the horror behind me, but there was ignoring the smell that came off of her, something like a blend of burnt meat and wet ash. I walked on, acting like I knew where I was going, but I had a nasty feeling that it wouldn't be long before Emily discovered my deception. And then what? We passed a room where a lone office chair spun silently, and then another filled with broken children's toys that had all been turned to face the wall. A steep staircase on my left led down into the darkness, while up ahead, the hallway forked again. If this kept up, I was going to lose track of the way back. Although maybe I thought darkly that wouldn't matter. For all I knew, the hallways behind me had already changed. "Hey!" Emily rasped, making me jump. "You didn't come from down here. How do you know this is the way out?" I began to stammer a response, but the words died in my throat. Something was coming. Something that moved with a slow and heavy, eloquent steps. A figure appeared at the end of the corridor ahead. It was at least 9 feet tall, but its true form was impossible to discern beneath its covering. "Ask him," I whispered to Emily. "He knows." To avoid looking at her face while I spoke, I focused on her eyes, and in them I read a storm of mixed emotions. Excitement, doubt, pain, and fear. Despite her transformation, there was no doubt the thing in front of me was still horribly, undeniably human. With one last suspicious glance, she lurched past and approached the shrouded figure, which had paused as though it was waiting for her. Standing before it, Emily seemed small. "My friend back there tells me that you know where the exit is," she murmured uncertainly. I crept away before I heard the deep, booming response that I knew was coming. There is no exit. The tall figure lowered its hood. Emily screamed. After her agonized shriek faded, there were no further sounds to make the passage of time. Just as I had feared, the corridor had shifted in my absence. The rooms were different and there were intersections and twists where there should have been none. As I continued blindly forward, I thought about what Emily had said, about how she had thought she was alone until she had heard my knock. The tall figure had appeared moments later, and the only change in all of it was me. Were the occupants of this hellish place called to me somehow, drawn in by the warmth of life? And if so, what else might be circling out there in the dark? At last I spotted a door, one whose wood-paneled design matched the ones that I knew. It stood out ominously among the gray walls and ruined furnishings nearby. As I reached for its knob, I couldn't help but wonder if I was walking into a trap. Instead, I stepped out into what used to be my childhood bedroom. According to the clock on the wall, hours had passed. To me, it felt like mere minutes. I touched my throat where Emily's hand had strangled me, but there was no sign of cuts or bruising. Could I really have blacked out and hallucinated all of it? Either way, the danger was too great to ignore. I wandered back to bed, where Sabrina was snoring softly. I wanted to caress her back, to curl up against her and tell her how much I loved her. But part of me was afraid that if I did, I would find Emily Gates' wide open, lidless eyes staring back at me. What if I really hadn't come back after all? I lay down nervously beside the woman who I hoped was really Sabrina, and I stared at the ceiling, exhausted but unable to sleep. I needed to see a psychiatrist, and I realized that I did know one, or at least I had when I was younger. Hugh's old friend, Helen. She was the head of the local university's mental health program, and if anybody could be trusted with my story, then it was probably her. I called Dr. Helen Ashmont's office first thing in the morning. A snarky receptionist told me to hold, please. But moments later, Helen herself came on the line. Her voice was just as smooth as I had remembered. She explained that she had been hoping to hear from me, but after Hugh's death, she hadn't wanted to impose. To my surprise, she offered to clear her schedule and meet me that same day. As I grabbed my keys from the dresser, I told Sabrina that I was going to pay a visit to an old friend of my uncle's. When I reached Helen's waiting room, I found myself wondering about another mystery. Emily Gates. Who had she been, really? A quick search revealed that the 21-year-old had been killed in a gruesome drunk driving accident a few weeks earlier. She had hit a family of 4 head-on. Shuddering, I slipped my device back into my pocket. Helen's office felt more like a cozy cafe than a medical facility. Rather than ask me how I was or the reason for my visit, Dr. Ashmont's first question was what sort of tea I preferred. While she boiled the hot water, I compared the woman before me to the one that I remembered from childhood. With her huge glasses, quick movements, and earth-tone clothing, she reminded me of a large, hyper-intelligent moth. Helen placed a steaming cup in front of each of us, enlaced her fingers, and asked how she could help. I could see why Helen was so successful as a psychologist. Almost without me realizing it, the story that I had been afraid to tell came pouring out. Between sips of tea, I revisited each one of those terrifying experiences, unsure even now if any of it was real. When I finally ran out of words, I asked Dr. Ashmont what she thought that I should do. Helen was quiet for a long moment, and then she raised her eyebrows and nodded to somebody behind me. For some reason, just turning my head felt like an enormous effort. When I did, I saw Darius and Arthur, Hugh's other close friends, standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard them come in. I mean, what were they even doing here? I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. I glanced at the empty porcelain cup in front of me and tried to vomit out whatever drug that I had been given, but there was no strength left in my body. The last thing that I remember was seeing Helen stare, watching with a mix of contempt and pity as I tumbled to the floor. The next thing I knew, I was being half dragged and half carried down a familiar hallway. I was back on the second floor of Hugh's house. Distracted by my weight and their own tense conversation, my elderly captors were unaware that I had woken up. I used this phone to message the fiancée, told her that there was an emergency. We've got a couple of hours. One of them was sane. He hesitated and then added, "Are we sure that we want to do this?" "Oh, none of us want to do this, Darius," Helen scoffed. "But it's the only way. Nobody will find him where we're going to put him. Once he's gone, the fiancé will sell the place at a loss, and Arthur can buy it through one of his slush funds. We'll be able to keep the public safe from it for a little while longer." The group halted. "There, that was quick," Helen huffed. "The house must be really feeding off this one." I could feel the fog lifting from my brain as sensation returned to my toes and fingers. I continued to feign unconsciousness as a door creaked open. Even through nearly closed eyelids, I recognized the darkness on the other side. "Help me push him inside, Arthur," Helen grunted. I felt myself flung forward. My legs were still too weak to stop it, but I managed to grab onto Dr. Ashmont's jacket as I fell. Her eyes widened with fear as we tumbled across the threshold. Darius shouted and the door slammed shut. And then everything went black. Helen groaned and climbed to her feet. I heard the click of a lighter being struck. A tiny orange flame illuminated the now familiar gray corridor. There was no sign of the door that we had fallen through. "Oh, well, you've gone and done it now, haven't you?" Dr. Ashmont sighed. "My fault, I suppose. I might have miscalculated the dosage. You've grown so much since the last time that we saw you." I demanded to know what the hell this was all about. Helen shut off the flame and listened to the darkness for a long moment before answering. "Arthur, Darius, your uncle and I formed a sort of study group back in college. We investigated abnormal occurrences in the county, and later, after we had achieved a success in the community, we did what we could to protect ordinary people from the danger that we had found. Darius has a room-sized vault full of antiques that will never see the light of day. Arthur has never fired a gun in his life, but on paper he owns some hunting land along Route 587, along with 6 abandoned cabins and 1 closed-down covered bridge. I stay on the lookout for patients more in need of an exorcism than medication. And as for your uncle, he volunteered to take the house. This house, the worst thing that we ever found. The rest of us wanted to burn it to the ground, but your uncle thought that it just might make things worse. And besides, who could guess what might be built here afterwards if we did? An office building, maybe a hospital, a school. Hugh thought that he could handle it, and he was right. Until you came along." A metallic groan like a rusted structure finally collapsing echoed down the hallway. We both fell silent. Maybe the sound had nothing to do with us. Maybe it was so far away that it didn't matter. Maybe. I asked Dr. Ashmont where she thought we were. "Oh, I suppose you could call it the afterlife. That's right. No pearly gates or scorching fire here. Just endless, lightless gray hallways. Rooms filled with the decaying remains of memory. The land of the dead. Sheol, the Hebrews called it. The common grave of humankind. There are places where the border between this world and ours is thin, and the house that you inherited is one of them. The inhabitants of this place seek out the living like mosquitoes hunting for warm blood, especially those who have been touched by death. Your parents are here too, you know, and they're most eager to see you again." There was a bitter, hopeless edge to Helen's voice that I didn't like at all. What was she talking about? "Oh, the dead want what the living have. At first, they usually tell themselves that they're just trying to get back to where they came from, but that longing eventually transforms into resentment, and then finally to hatred. After a while, they don't remember who they were or what it was to be alive. All they have left is a desire to inflict pain on anything with a pulse. The dead know that we're here, and when they find us, they'll torture us until we join them. I couldn't believe it. My uncle's old friends had been willing to just dump me off in a place like this. Oh, I know it seems cruel. Helen admitted as though she were reading my thoughts, but we couldn't be sure that somebody like you would do the right thing if you ever learned the truth about this house. Someone like me. Even after all these years, it still came back to who my parents had been, to my rotten childhood on the wrong side of the tracks. As far as people like Helen were concerned, I would always be damaged goods, tainted somehow, and disposable. Maybe that empty space and the dust among Hugh's things had been a letter meant for me, one that would have explained everything, but his closest friends hadn't trusted me with the knowledge. Worse yet, I was stuck here with one of them, and our survival might depend on working together. That low metallic groan reverberated through the corridor once again. If I had to guess, I would say that was the walls rearranging themselves, helping our pursuers get just a little bit closer. Helen said, striking her lighter once again. We should keep moving. As we walked, Dr. Ashmont told me about the various explorations that her study group had made of the place. She spoke of shifting corridors, malfunctioning equipment, and entities so horrifying that it was hard to believe that they had ever been human. Maybe talking about it was cathartic for her, or maybe it was just a way to distract from how dim our flame seemed compared to the long, hungry shadows around it. The longer that she talked, the more clear it became to me that she didn't believe either of us were going to make it out alive. It was strange how easy it became to ignore the foul stenches and skittering sound that came from within the rooms on either side of the hallway. It was better not to look. Better to stay focused on the bare gray walls and simply hope to pass by unnoticed. The strategy even worked. For a little while at least. Helen explained that her group had never spent more than an hour in this impossible place, and one of the most important things that they had learned was to never take the stairs. Leaving the current level reduced the odds of escape from slim to zero, in fact, which they only understood after the loss of the fifth member of their group, Catherine. Oh, she was probably Hugh's first true love, and he never was really the same man after she disappeared, you know. Helen laughed sadly. Sometimes I think I agreed to watch over this place just to be close to her, or maybe even to keep looking for her behind our backs. It was my first time hearing any of this. I thought back to the night that I had run into Hugh wandering the hallways with an oil lamp, and I shuddered. Helen, meanwhile, had stopped dead. The three-way intersection before us was made up entirely of staircases leading downward. With a sinking feeling, I looked over my shoulder. Just as I had feared, the hallway behind had transformed into a staircase as well. I can't, Helen murmured. I just can't. I did my best to reason with her. She had said herself that the longer we stayed in one place, the easier that it would be for the denizens of this place to find us. But she remained frozen. Something was approaching. Something that moved with a scratching shuffle that reminded me of a dog's claws as scraping against concrete. I tried once more to get Dr. Ashmont moving, but she shook her head, ignoring even the hot metal of the lighter as it seared the flesh of her trembling hand. You don't know what it's like. You didn't see Katie look up at us and say that she'd be right back. You didn't see her vanish like she was sinking into a lake of oil. You weren't there. Whatever was coming sounded like it was almost on top of us, but all I saw was a pair of freakishly long limbs and two pale, six-fingered hands perched on the stairs. Something that might have been spit dribbled into Helen's silvery hair. I didn't look at the thing that lifted her up into the darkness. I just grabbed her lighter as it fell, and I ran. Helen never had a chance to scream. I sprinted blindly down the stairs until I found another twisting corridor, one which led to more cluttered rooms and a bridge over some great and windy emptiness. It was that narrow strip of gray floor barely as wide as my foot, which finally had forced me to slow down. A cool, foul-smelling air buffeted me from side to side as I made my way across. When I reached the other side, I collapsed against the wall, panting. I was utterly, hopelessly lost. I killed the flame of Helen's lighter and shook it. The fuel chamber was over half empty. I sat in the inky blackness, eyes shut, listening to my own gasping breaths. That awful sound like claws on concrete didn't reappear. I could hear the distant groans of the space around me rearranging itself, but there was nothing that I could do about it now. When the pain in my legs finally subsided and my breathing had returned to normal, I climbed to my feet and I flicked on the lighter. My mother's rotten face grinned down at me from above. "My sweet boy." Something that had once been a hand brushed against my cheek. "Stay still and I promise this won't hurt for very long." Who could guess how long she had been waiting there, just inches away from me, waiting for a chance to strike? Jagged teeth glinted at the lighter's flickering flame. And then came a deafening rumble. I tumbled backward through where the wall used to be. I cried out as I bounced off one step after another, falling down further and further into the darkness. In the back of my pain-rattled mind, I wondered if this was how Catherine had felt before, well, the end. I rolled to a stop. The lighter clattered against the ground and I pawed blindly until I found it. It took multiple strikes to light the flame. I wondered just how many minutes of light I had left. The space that I was in was so large that I could see nothing but endless gray floor and empty darkness. I finally understood the paralyzing fear that had overcome Helen at the top of all those stairs. What would it feel like to be alone in this pitch blackness, with nothing solid to hold on to? What would it feel like to be hunted through it by things that I couldn't see? "Jake." At first, I thought that I had only imagined Uncle Hugh's voice. And then a pair of worn but polished black shoes stepped into the dim ring of firelight. "Don't be afraid. Every instinct is telling me to hurt you, but I'm not that far gone. Not yet." "Why?" I stammered. "Why would you lead me in this place if you knew what it was? What it led to?" "Oh, because I believed in you. More than anyone, and I still do. Look to your left. There is a door, a real solid wooden door. The longer you spend in this place, the more it becomes a part of you, and you of it." Hugh went on. "I can make a way out for you, but you have to hurry." The pitch of Hugh's words rose and fell. His graying hands and yellowed nails were clenched into fists, as though he were holding himself back from something. That claw-like scraping was back. Hugh doubled over. "Catherine will be back soon," he grunted. "And she has been here far, far longer than I have. Go." "Thank you," I stammered. For everything." I fled through the escape that Hugh had made for me before he could strike. Darius gasped when he saw me. Arthur lifted his hands weakly like he expected me to fight him. "Helen?" Darius asked, and I shook my head. I looked at them, these two wizened old men who had tried to kill me to keep their secrets. Their frightened eyes seemed to ask, "What now?" "Hugh would have wanted us to protect this place," I told them. "Will you help me?" At first, Sabrina was just grateful that I was all right. Her joy turned to disbelief, however, when I told her that our bed and breakfast needed to close indefinitely. I didn't go into details, saying only that I now understood that this wasn't what Hugh would have wanted. I did, however, have some good news. A wealthy foundation had purchased a similar old home close to the university. They had heard of our success and they wanted to restore it and set up a similar business there. Remodeling the place had been Sabrina's favorite part of the whole business. There was no need to mention that Arthur Blevins was the foundation's chairman. Sabrina and I left Hugh's house exactly as we had found it. On paper, it continued to be listed as a bed and breakfast that was closed for renovations. To avoid arousing suspicions, I still went by from time to time to switch on the lights or make a light lunch in the kitchen. Sometimes I even took advantage of the opportunity to read in my old nook, but I never spent the night or closed any doors behind me. I ignored any sounds that I heard inside the walls, and wherever you are, I suggest you do the same. Because I have no doubt that there are more houses out there like Hugh's place.